Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 13. So I've gotten back to most of you on your paper proposals now, and overall, I think they look really good. With a few of you, I just said things like I need more detail, or I want to see that you've got a scholarly source, or I told you to try and find another source. But I think you're in a good position. So I'm looking forward to receiving your papers and just seeing what you've all written. All right, and this first slide that you're looking at here is one that I've used in classrooms before, and it's one that I like to use to get a bit of a discussion going on just the way that we mythologize the West, especially through movies. Got my assistant Sam here. Sam has a toad. Help. Right. So one. Thank you, Sam. You're a good man. One of the things that I really like to point out as a turning point in popular culture, at least in my own life, and a lot of the popular culture that I've been familiar with, is the movie Dances with Wolves. For me, it was the first time I had ever seen a movie where the Indians weren't just one-dimensional bad guys. As a kid in the 1980s, we frequently played cowboys and Indians, and the Indians were always the bad guys. Everybody always wanted to be the cowboys. So I remember seeing the movie in the drive-through theater with my older brother. Also, the first time I ever had strawberry Shasta. So, expanding my palate, expanding my mind. The movie was extremely transformational for me. But so many of the movies that I've listed here, or TV shows, were much more simplistic in the way they imagined the West. And so I want to get into the relevance of this and why it matters. So I, Charles Mann, I think, at the beginning of the semester, in the sorry, I'm having a hard time concentrating because I have a friend here. Good having you, man. So at the beginning of the semester, in the reading 1491 with a toad, yes, uh, Charles Mann did a really nice job critiquing simplistic assumptions about Native Americans, showing that they weren't just the noble savages imagined in things like that anti-littering public service announcement. I've got a toad climbing up my neck that I gave you, nor were they the horrific savages of cowboy movies of an earlier era. They were actual, real, complicated people, and obviously still are. So, the point of both the 1491 show and something I hope you glean from this presentation is that dehumanization, simplistic approaches to human beings, lead to tragic consequences, regardless of what the simplistic approach is. So, let's see if I can get this toad off of me. No, the toad. It won't work. Oh, lucky me. All right, so this map here shows the major native groups in North America at the time of contact. The colors refer to language families. Oftentimes, different languages within similar families were mutually intelligible. And given the continent wide connections native peoples had, many people were quite capable of speaking multiple languages. So, this is also a map that would radically change over the next few centuries. As European settlers came, people moved away from them. Uh, and as government policies forcibly deported natives, typically farther west. So other groups like your Osterhammel reading shows change based on their own economic and political calculations. So people in the plains, through the use of horses, were able to expand far beyond traditional territories. And down in Texas, for decades in the 19th century, the real political power was neither Mexican nor American. It was the Comanche Empire, Comancheria as it's sometimes called. So today, as a legacy of Indian removal and the reservation system, a majority of Native Americans live west of the Mississippi, even if they had traditionally lived in the east. So, in fact, 31% of all Native American people in the United States live in just the states of California, Arizona, and Oklahoma. So, some key watershed years for Native relations were between 1830 and 1848. I've got a toad climbing up the back of my neck right now. Um, this period was bookended by the beginning of Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy and the end of the Mexican-American War, when the U.S. annexed almost the entire territory that is today the continental United States. So there was an understanding that land across the Mississippi would be reserved for native peoples, at least after 1832. Um, But already in the 1830s, people began streaming across the Mississippi to claim Western lands. So with the opening of the trails that we discussed 2 weeks ago, like along with the Oregon, Mormon, and California migrations, many non-natives became convinced that Western lands shouldn't stay in native hands indefinitely. You've got ideas like manifest destiny that we've talked about. So in the 1850s, a movement emerged clamoring for Western lands to be given to East Euro American settlers. The Homestead Act was finally pushed through during the Civil War, which happens to also be the beginning of perhaps the most violent period of the settler native engagement. I should point out that I'm diverging somewhat from Osterhammel with this presentation. He gives you a good big picture economic overview, and I want to look at some specifics and really think about how these episodes impact our collective responsibility to the past. Something I obviously want to be talking about as we get into the Civil War and its aftermath as well next week. All right. I'll keep my picture and my son's toad out of this one. This is very serious. Andrew Myrick was reported to have said, "Let them eat grass and their own dung." So most left angry without any food. So as this was happening, a group of four native teenagers decided to rob a chicken coop at a farmhouse on the outskirts of New Ulm. And in the testimony they later gave as they were trying to steal some eggs, one of the youth got scared and said it was too dangerous to steal from white people. The others accused him of being a coward, and in the argument that ensued, a woman came out who they killed in a panic. Uh, when they were pursued by her husband and another family, they were also killed. Um, Sorry, the other settlers. So when these natives returned and confessed what they had done to a tribal council, Red Cloud, who had successfully advocated peace after their rebuff by the traders, became convinced that no explanation would work, that war was now inevitable. So earlier, some natives had hoped that with the Civil War going on, the U.S. might not have the resources to fight an Indian war too. So they reasoned now might be their best opportunity to push settlers out of Minnesota and regain their lost territories. And there were many low-level skirmishes going on in this period. I mean, some were quite significant, with estimates that as high as 800 settlers were killed in these fights. Um, Red Cloud, he disagreed that now was an opportune time for war. He had been to Washington, D.C., he had seen trainloads of men headed into battle, and he was convinced that the U.S. government had the power to wage war both on the Confederates and on Native Americans. So they counseled for war after these murders, and Red Cloud and his allies thought they should attack Mankato, defeat the lightly defended garrison, and get some food. Others wanted to attack the city of New Ulm for the sake of loot. They agreed to attack Mankato, but as the battle for Mankato began, a group of natives left to go for New Ulm. So by the time they arrived at New Ulm, the settlers had learned of their coming. There was actually a former veteran of the Austro-Hungarian military who organized the people in and to fight. These were mostly German settlers defending their homes and defending their lives, really. So by the time they arrived at New Ulm, the settlers had built barricades, they had built defensive works, they had organized themselves, and they fought back, sending the natives running, overwhelmingly defeating them. So, I'm just sharing all this to complicate simplistic notions of who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. This was really the first major engagement of what would become the Civil War and post-Civil War era Indian Wars. The natives, they absolutely committed a crime. They murdered innocent civilians. They did so, however, because the government wasn't honoring its treaty obligations and because the people who did it were foolish children going against the wishes of their tribe. So lack of communication quickly led to conflict, which the natives lost as the settlers logically and in this case rightly defended themselves against unwarranted attack. So after this defeat, an army group arrived that arrested virtually the entire tribe. And this is where, the really horrific nature of the oppression against Native Americans comes to bear. They sentenced over 300 people to be executed. Abraham Lincoln personally commuted the death sentences of all but 36 people. Due to a clerical error, 38 people were executed on what was the largest government execution to occur on a single day in U.S. history. So the Santee Sioux were then exiled further west. um, again with horrific loss of life. So another region where conflict exploded during the Civil War was in New Mexico. So the Navajo, in particular, had antagonistic relations with their neighbors and sporadic fighting with American settlers as they started coming through their territory on the Santa Fe Trail. Chief Manuelito, in particular, was prone to attacks. So these conflicts largely died down after a treaty recognized Navajo territory in 1851. The Navajo, they really prospered in this period. They had long been part of Spanish and later Mexican economic circles, and they had developed a type of desert hardy sheep whose wool products, such as their famed rugs, continue to this day to fetch thousands of dollars per rug. So when the Civil War began, unfortunately, conflict also began with the Navajo. The military strengthened an outpost at Ojo de Oso that would later become Fort Wingate. The Confederacy had a different name too in between, claimed New Mexico and even sent an expedition to seize it. They were quickly rebuffed by the Union, who remained stationed there for the remainder of the war and beyond. So at first, the troops didn't seem like much of a threat. Navajo people liked to come there to race horses and gamble on the races. In 1862, something really unfortunate happened during one of the races. The Navajo's top rider fell off his horse and lost. His friends noticed that someone had cut his stirrup, so the Navajo assumed that one of the soldiers had cheated and refused to pay the wager they had lost. The uh, the commander in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Antonio Chavez, a native New Mexican, insisted that the natives had lost and had to pay. And native New Mexican, I mean like a Chicano. So he was one of the descended from Mexican settlers who had been there for centuries already at this point. And he had a commission in the U.S. military. So when the natives left the fort without paying, Chavez ordered his troops to fire on them. Many of the soldiers actually refused the order to fire. The Navajo were their friends after all. But plenty did shoot, and this led to the next stage of conflict with the Navajo. Later, General Carleton insisted on moving the Navajo to a reservation, the same reservation where they live today. They had previously lived on the best land in New Mexico, land today that's taken up by large, non-native operated dairy farms and alfalfa fields. So as Carleton exiled the natives, he burned their homes, killed their flocks of sheep, and vindictively chopped down all of their 5,000 peach trees, known to be some of the best peaches in the Southwest. Thousands of people also died in what was called the Long March to their reservation, a march that was reminiscent for many of the Trail of Tears. Today, some of these people still live in a barren stretch of desert that straddles New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. I drove through the New Mexico part of the reservation in 2017 and had two different people at gas stations hit me up for cash, and it was obvious they were in an area where all opportunity had been robbed of them. There are better parts of the reservation, to be sure, but not where I was. I imagine that these people's ancestors were probably too busy tending their peaches and herding sheep to have had time to hit anyone up for $5. So, when news of Chavez's perfidy and Carleton as well reached Eastern newspapers, people there were outraged that massacres had occurred in the name of the American people. So they demanded that Carleton lose his command, that Chavez lose his command, which he did. A commission was also set up to investigate his crimes, and he briefly went to prison, though his sentence was commuted. But this is a key point I want to make. Most Americans were opposed to massacring the natives. But they also believed, through their racist notions, that the natives were incapable of governing themselves. And they believed that white Americans should have their land. So, despite finding them unpleasant, massacres continued to happen. So, I want to talk about another massacre that happened during the Civil War that illustrates the cruelty, confusion, and opportunism that so often characterized the colonization of the American West. So in 1864, a failed businessman and itinerant preacher used his contacts to get a commission, calling himself Colonel Shivington. The military was a lot less professional in the period of the Civil War than it is today, so people without experience could get commands like this. Shivington also had ambitions to maybe rise through the ranks and become governor of Colorado someday. So He figured he needed to prove his mettle as an Indian fighter first. So he was ordered to defend Colorado against the Confederates and hunt down the Dog Soldiers, a group of largely Cheyenne who were engaging in acts of terror against settler trains, hoping to stall the settlement of Easterners and immigrants on native lands. But instead of going after the Soldiers, where he might have had actual conflict to worry about, he attacked a peaceful band of Cheyenne, and he had been involved in engagement with Confederate soldiers earlier. But he attacked a band of Cheyenne led by Black Kettle, who was flying an American flag at the time and had papers from the U.S. government showing himself to be an ally. In this attack in the early morning, 150 mostly women, and some estimates go much higher. But mostly women and children were gunned down in the early morning while most were still sleeping. When people in the East found out about this, they were outraged. They demanded he be court-martialed, which occurred along with a commission of inquiry. So again, a horrific massacre occurred against the wishes of most Americans, yet as they continued to steal native land, they also profited from these massacres, from the dispossession that the massacre had caused. So many of the more iconic final battles of the Indian Wars involved Sioux confederations in the Northern Plains. So in 1876, Sitting Bull, who witnessed the expulsion of the Santee Sioux from Minnesota, and Crazy Horse united a confederation of several thousand Lakota, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho soldiers in what was called the Great Sioux War. The U.S. military was trying to force the Sioux back into their reservations, which they had left for better hunting opportunities, and to take part in the Sundance Ritual, an ancient yet revived millenarian movement that was widespread across Plains groups. During the Sundance Ritual in 1876, Sitting Bull had a vision of soldiers falling dead into his camp like locusts, and he hoped that this was a vision of their potential future success. So later that summer, his forces were able to ambush the 7th Cavalry under General George Custer, the same group that later killed Black Kettle in a subsequent massacre 4 years after Chivington's attack. But in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand, as it's sometimes called, this would immediately become part of the mythology of winning the West. He and all in the 5 companies under his command died in a fight to the death, not unlike the Alamo 40 years earlier. So when the Sioux War was over, many fled into Canada, and others returned to their reservations. In 1890, the Army went after them again when a group of Sioux returned from Canada. At Wounded Knee, roughly 300 Native Americans were massacred after a weapon discharge while the Army was in the process of disarming the Sioux. Troops began to fire indiscriminately, with an early form of a machine gun even, eventually burying the dead in the mass grave pictured here. That massacre was the end of the Indian Wars, and many Americans began to then celebrate the closing of the frontier and American expansion across a continent. But for so many generations of 20th century Americans, Native Americans in particular, what hurt far worse than the Indian Wars were the attempts to delegitimize and destroy Native peoples and cultures in the 20th century for supposed enlightened, humane reasons. So after 1890, the federal government often forced Native children into boarding schools. These schools, the very process of destroying a culture, of breaking down a child, that notion that even needs to be done is abusive in nature. And not only was this psychological abuse, but there was physical and sexual abuse that was widespread against these vulnerable children, notably at the Carleton School in Pennsylvania. Um, so these schools were rife with abuse, with high death rates, with suicide, and debilitating depression so common for their victims. Um, and they were also intended more to control than to educate Native youth. So they had widespread support among non-natives too, and they're really just a horrifying chapter in American history. So I've got some bonus question. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide. And I just want to point out that you know, these these ideas of supremacy that underpinned the way Euro Americans behaved towards Native Americans was unfortunately widespread in the 19th century. across the world. Native peoples in Brazil, indigenous peoples in Australia, Siberian natives in Russia. They all faced racially informed policies from settler governments. This is also the era when so many European countries began to expand their colonial control over Africa, reasoning that they needed to follow the example that the United States had set in its brutal subjugation of Native Americans, arguing that Native Africans were inferior people as well. And so by 1914, almost all of Africa had been carved into colonial empires, where people were as exploited and demeaned and dehumanized as natives were in the United States. So, and yet the colonization of Africa was also justified by supposed progress and an enlightened culture taking an inferior culture under its wing. And it also involved things like the kinds of schools I talked about in my last slide. And across the world, people resisted this, but the real resistance would get going in the 20th century with the massive global transnational networks that mobilized against imperialism. So that's that's what I have for week 13, and I've got some focus or bonus questions for you here, and look forward to seeing your results and looking at your papers. All right, everybody have a good week. Talk to you later.